Hello and welcome to the second podcast on my personalised view of the changing roles of the quantity surveyor. I've called this episode The Quantity Surveyor, the Billy Nomates of Construction. In the previous podcast, I described the golden age of quantity surveying in the 1970s, and that, in my opinion, the single event that put an end to the gravy train as the introduction of compulsory competitive tendering, or CCT, in the 1980s. CCT was one of the key privatisation methods of the Conservative government, and initially CCT forced public sector bodies, such as local authorities, to invite tenders from the private sector and private sector contractors to compete against its own direct labour organisations in an attempt to drive down prices. After a few years, CCT was expanded to panel consultants, that's to say architects, quantity surveyors, etc., retained on an approved list or panel by a local authority. Initially, panel consultants showed willingness to comply by submitting quotes based on scale of fees less 5 or 10%. However, in the early 1980s, as a deep recession started to bite, competition for work saw discounts rise to scale of fees less 70% or even more. Consequently, by early 1991, the average fee for QS services had dropped to about 2%. For many, this was unsustainable, and the many one-trick pony practices either went out of business or were taken over by larger organisations. The gravy train had finally hit the buffers. The decline in fee income coincided with a global recession from 1990 to 1995, and during this period, 500,000 talented people at all levels left the construction industry, never to return. Not unsurprisingly, the Monopolies and Mergers Commission recommended the RICS scale of fees should be binned as anti-competitive, and today RICS members can no longer use any of these scales in agreeing rates for current jobs. During the 1990s, as well as falling workloads, QSs were also struggling with their own identity, as it became obvious that producing bills of quantities would no longer pay the bills. Practices started to rebadge themselves as construction economists, project managers, cost consultants, etc. In fact, almost anything other than quantity surveyors, in an attempt to distance themselves from an increasingly bad press. People were beginning to ask the question, who needs quantity surveyors? Europe at our feet. In January 1993, the UK joined the European single market. At a time of world recession, many thought it would be a great opportunity to expand into Europe. QSs dreamed of flying down to Nice to do a quick site visit or valuation before grabbing a quick crep and returning to the UK. At around this time, there were a variety of very expensive seminars explaining to UK contractors and professionals how to go about winning work in Europe. Expectations were high. At the time, I was actually working in Paris. What nobody told UK construction was that despite all the hype, Europe had survived for hundreds of years without quantity surveyors, and the EU public sector was the biggest closed shop known to man, and the chances of pricing work away from Italian or French contractors, particularly Italian, was nil. It soon became apparent that European states manipulated the single rules to retain work within their boundaries without any fear of redress from Brussels, as France expertly demonstrated in the procurement of the Stade de France for the 1998 World Cup in Paris, when work was divided into small packages so that they didn't fall within the scope of the single market rules and could be tendered for solely in France. The rise of design and build. Quantity surveying. The hint is in the name, really. Bills of quantities are at the heart of what QSs do, and yet the use of bill of quantities has seen a decline in the last 30 years. Why is this? Incidentally, in Scotland, where I'm currently based, bills of quantities are still comparatively popular. However, anecdotally, it is said that in the UK, the further you travel south, the less the likelihood is that you will spot a bill of quantities. Over the years, I have delivered CPD sessions to large quantity surveying practices in London, where QSs in their late 20s, early 30s admit having never worked on bills of quantities preparation. Many QS-orientated degree courses have no or very little measurement, and yet still get professional body recognition. In some ways, the industry in the UK seems to have reverted to the days before quantity surveyors, when each builder submitted a tender, took off and priced their own quantities. So what's the reason for the decline in the bill of quantities? After all, the advantages of having bills of quantities in both pre- and post-contract phases are well documented. In the 1990s, clients were increasingly advised to move away from the traditional procurement approach using a bill of quantities and instead move to design and build or design and construct. They're the same thing. The big attraction of design and build for clients is that risk is transferred from the client to the contractor. After all, if it's the contractor who designs the project, then the amount of time and money spent on reworking once the job starts on site should, in theory, be cut to a minimum, or, in the best case scenario, eliminated altogether. From a modest start, design and build has risen to be the preferred procurement route in over 40% of all projects. Initially, the RICS resisted the move to greater contractor supply chain involvement, as this approach results in lower involvement and fee income for its QS members. Of course, design and construct is not all good news for clients. Aesthetics are given a very low priority. In many cases, the final project is functional but boring. The problem with design and build in the UK is that the industry is not really geared up to it, as say in France. A typical scenario in the UK is that a contractor on a design and build tender list will form a temporary alliance with an architect, engineer and QS for that one job. For the consultants, their fees may be based on a no-win, no-fee basis. If the bid is unsuccessful, the members of the temporary alliance go their separate ways, whereas in France, the largest contractors retain their own house multidisciplinary professionals, the so-called bureau d'études. Other reasons for the demise of bills of quantities were the high cost of professional fees and the length of time taken to produce tender documentation. The world was becoming impatient, and so-called fast-track procurement was introduced in the form of management contracting and construction management to deliver buildings more quickly, both of which have their place, but in the right circumstances. And yet more reports. During the last 50 years, there have been more reports than you can shake a stick at on the perceived inefficiency of UK construction. Most were commissioned by government and told the same story of poor value for money and inefficient working, and most of the reports, to be honest, were ignored. However, because of the lack of work in 1994, the Latham report was taken more seriously, as people had time on their hands. The main focus of Latham was the lack of cooperation between the supply and the demand side and the lack of trust involved. In fact, the report's subtitle was Trust in the Team. Nevertheless, it is traditionally very difficult to convince a fragmented industry that they should adopt a new approach to working. The big players, say the top 3%, took note, and the remainder ignored it, as they couldn't see any advantage to changing things. In the aftermath of the publication of the Latham report, I attended several seminars, some chaired by the man himself, Latham, to discuss how to implement his recommendations. What quickly became apparent was the attendees to these seminars were all the same people, from the same top 3 companies. It was like a Latham Levin, but for the majority of the industry, the Latham report was an irrelevance. Eventually, Latham stepped aside and was replaced by Sir John Egan as Head of Constructing Excellence. Egan, a former boss in the car industry, where he was credited with saving Jaguar. Egan was no fan of quantity surveyors and called the whole future of quantity surveying into question in the Construction Industry Task Force report, Rethinking Construction. Even the RICS turned on the QS in the think tank report, Questioning the Future of the Profession, when it described the QS as arrogant, friendless, and uncooperative. Recognise these traits? In addition, the report continued that quantity surveyors were perceived to add nothing to the construction process. With friends like this, who needs enemies? The dawn of the new millennium saw no let-up in the anti-QS rhetoric, with a lead article in the well-known building magazine entitled, "Will we soon be drying a tear over a grave marked RIP Quantity Surveying, 1792 to 2000, as, not for the first time, Building announced that the QS was dead and QS services would not be needed in the 21st century. To rub salt into the wounds, at about this time, two comedy legends, Monty Feldman and John Cleese, of Monty Python and Fawlty Towers fame, appeared in a TV sketch called Ethel the Aardvark Goes Quantity Surveying, which, as you can imagine, did little to enhance the image of the QS. Two more critical reports followed from John Egan before he resigned in frustration. His final report in 2002 was called Accelerating Change and reflected the fact that UK construction had not warmed to his suggestion. The one thing Egan failed to grasp was that introducing change into the UK motor industry, which had a limited number of manufacturers, 25 at most in the 1990s, is a totally different task to introducing change into the construction industry with 100,000 contractors and its associated professions of varying sizes and specialisms, producing bespoke projects on diverse locations exposed to the elements. Some years later, when asked about the response of UK construction to the Accelerating Change report, Egan conceded that the results were patchy and awarded the industry 4 out of 10 for compliance. Just telling somebody they're rubbish or what they're doing isn't likely to prompt much response. People need an incentive and encouragement to change, and as a whole the industry came to the conclusion, rightly or wrongly, it was sticking to the knitting. The changing nature of practice. Prior to 2001, most RICS regulated firms were structured as partnerships, meaning that the partners whose names appeared above the line on the practice's headed paper were liable for the full extent of their wealth and debts of the business. So we're talking about family homes, savings that could be seized and sold to pay any debts of the partnership. What's more, partners were jointly and severally liable for the debts and misdemeanours of other partners. So choose your bedfellows carefully was the watchword. This draconian system meant there was no limit on the liability of partners above the line, and yes, you've guessed it, the structure was enforced by the RICS bylaws that prohibited any other arrangement. However, in 2001, limited liability partnerships came into force, allowing the liability of the partners to be limited. A limited liability partnership, or LLP, allows for a partnership structure where each partner's liabilities are limited to the amount they put into the business. In addition, partners were no longer responsible or liable for other partners' misconduct or negligence. Unsurprisingly, since 2001, LLPs have been widely adopted by surveyors, architects, accountants, etc. The continuing need for quantity surveyors to seek other sources of income, rather than bills of quantities, resulted in consolidation of the traditional QS practice as they ran for the safety of larger companies. Multidisciplinary firms such as Capita, ACOM and W.S. Atkins started to buy up QS firms without really understanding the nature of what they were getting. For example, Capita describes itself as an outsourcing group. I remember giving a series of RICS APC seminars at Capita's head office in London to their QS and project management candidates. I found Capita's offices truly disorientating, as I expected it to be lined with construction and QSy material. Instead, all I could see was literature relating to army recruitment, the DVLA, running ULEZ for the GLC, and pensions administration. There was nothing that could be identified as construction or QS related. It was weird. AJ and CJ Willis, referred to in a previous podcast, wouldn't have known what to make of this, and certainly would not have approved of Capita's shiny offices or its clients. In the early 2000s, the RICS decided it was time to revise SMM7 and to draw up a set of new guidance that would illustrate best practice in producing cost plans, bills of quantities and whole life costs. Some years later, NRM1, NRM2 and NRM3 were published. The NRM suite, as it became known, has received a mixed reception. I think it's fair to say that NRM1 has generally been well received, as for the first time it gives QSs a structure when giving cost advice and preparing estimates and cost plans. However, when it comes to NRM2, the industry remains firmly wedded to SMM7. Stuart Earle of Leeds, who was the lead for the NRM2 working group, dreams that on the publication of NRM2 there would be a large bonfire of all SMM7s and it would be confined to the archives. Sadly, that was not the case, and more than 12 years after its publication, Amazon is still selling textbooks in SMM format. I have run several discussion groups on social media platforms trying to get to the bottom of the reluctance of the industry to ditch SMM7. Once again, it seems to come down to the fact that no one can see any financial advantage for change. Did I start this podcast saying that one of the QS's greatest attributes was adaptability? As for NRM3, whole life costs, although increasingly important, is not for the moment a mainstream activity for most practices and consequently remains the least utilised volume of the NRM suite. So, I finished this episode in the early part of the 21st century. The internet was in its infancy, with dial-up modems being the norm. The first iPhone would not be released until 2007. Global warming and carbon emissions were starting to hit the headlines, and the publication of the Stern Review in 2006 and other major construction-based recessions and financial crises were about to hit the world.